Michael, your memories of your dear mother Rebecca remind me of a comment that Tom Feelings made about his mother, speaking about this same kind of overflowing of love. And he said not only did she love him, but she taught him that he deserved to be loved, and that was a very powerful, significant realization for him. As you were given that kind of grace, we can call it, that kind of gift, what did that mean in terms of your then going out into the world outside the house, into the school, into the community? What did Rebecca's grounding mean for you? How did it affect you as you went out into the world around you?
Well, I think the main thing that affected me, and it's really been significant in my life of always being on the margins of society, if you will, in terms of my causes, is that I did not have a need for acceptance, a pure acceptance. So that by saying that clearly, I had friends, love having friends. I am not a loner. I'm a very gregarious, public kind of person. But on the other hand, I can the need for acceptance did not allow me, or that I was able to hold my ground.
Yes, yes.
And that there are many times, even going back to my youth, when I was where my views so went against the norm or the accepted conventional view.
Do you remember any example from that youth
Yeah.
period when you were in that kind of situation?
That in terms of school, that I tended to be very intellectually inquisitive, and so I was always challenging things. Even the pledge of allegiance to the flag was always a thorn in my side. In fact, I finally stopped doing it in high school. But and I would just challenge the notion of those words in relationship to the reality of African American experience of racism. That increasingly that I began questioning components of religion, although not so much religion, but the practice of those who went to church, because that I could never understand, because there were people who, I mean, we had Sunday clothes, so we looked just like everyone else in church, but there were people who were poorer than us who did not have the Sunday clothes, and people would talk about them, and that always bothered me. I used to always challenge that notion of why that was important at all. I mean, in terms of my reading of Jesus, and that I always felt discomfort. It seemed that in spite of the fact that Jesus was among the least of us, the people who I always saw being praised were the most of us, if you will. So that always bothered me, and I would always raise those kind of issues, and people would, I mean, I was always viewed as a troublemaker. But the thing about, the religion, I realized, and I've been thinking about this, is that I never had a fear of God or Jesus. I mean, so my mother never, told us we were going to hell, or we were going to burn. That I never had a negative view of Jesus, if you will. That I had a negative view of the church, at least evolved. But I always saw Jesus as kind of a secular friend for me. And
even in your youth?
Yes, even my youth. I mean, that the stories that I identified with was like the story of Joseph, and the story of Joseph's compassion for his brothers after all that had happened to him. That the stories of Jesus defending the oppressed, I mean, always resonated with me. I mean, those are the things that I used to always find that incongruity congruity with pomp and circumstance,
Yes.
and my notion of Jesus.
Yes.
And I mean that in many ways that again, I really did not concern myself much with either the resurrection or the birth of Jesus. I mean, that just didn't grab me one way or another. It was just insignificant to me. But the life of Jesus was very significant to me. And so that there was a sense of service and of uplifting
Yes.
humanity that always resonated. But it was always love. I mean, I've never thought about if I do this, I'm going to hell. If I don't do this, I mean, I've never had that sort of a relationship
Yes.
with the spiritual. I
Yes.
mean, it's always been looking for the spiritual to become a better person.
Yes.
But it was never a fear of, if you do this, you cannot, that. So, and my mother's view of religion was never that kind of fear.
Yes.
And so it just imbued me that way.
That's great, and gave you grounds to stand on.
Yes.
Without fear.
Yes.
That's a
Yes.
powerful
Yes.
kind of gift.
And the other thing was, my mother was not a vengeful person. I mean, she had some really horrendous things in her life to happen to her, including sexual assault within her
Yes.
family
Yes.
of her. She was a very vulnerable
Yes.
young woman. People who she was kind to were, when they got on their feet, just ignored her. She never was vengeful. And so that, I mean, a thing that I have come to tell my children, even though she didn't put it this way, but I always tell my children, good deeds are their own reward.
Yes.
And that you do something good because you're doing something. You don't do it as a down payment for the future.
Yes.
So that if I loan you $10 and you never do anything for me, so be it. It is because you needed that money. So that my mother didn't say that, but she practiced that good deeds,
you got the message,
were their own reward.
Yes.
And that's how I tended to view things.
How did she go with you internally as you went into school and as you developed as a student?
Well, one, just that academic achievement was very important to her. I mean, she said, you may not be able to get an A, but you do the best you can, and so that was part of it. That she also would stand by me in my little causes, because.
What kind of little causes? Say a little bit more about that.
I'm trying to think. Goodness gracious. That I went to school, that all of my educational experience was in schools that were in transition. So that was always in integrated neighborhood schools. I mean that schools that where whites were beginning to leave, but they had been predominantly white. So that sometimes I would get into discussions on particularly race matters. I can remember me trying to talk about the experience of Emmett Till in school, and teachers did not want to discuss that, and my mother would, and they would threaten me with suspension, even in terms of my insistence. My mother would come up to school because the only time because my mother had to work. I mean, for her to take off is serious.
Yes.
But I used to love for her to come to school because she had such a presence about her, and I used to see school authorities just treat black parents with such disrespect.
Yes.
And my mother just would and at one time that we used to have these free falls kind of things, and at one time I was on the bottom of a pile and I bit a white student who was a friend of mine. It was just one of those kid things. He couldn't breathe.
Yes.
But the teacher really just, at least my teacher really just took it to the point where she was threatening to have me arrested and sent to the youth study center, which was the youth prison. And when Rebecca heard that, I mean, I just think of it. She immediately would have, I mean, the thought of her, not my Michael, as she would say. So that she would really stand up, come to the fore in high school, things got very serious because
Yes.
because my high school period was from '60 to '63. Malcolm X, the civil rights
Right.
movement. I was on
Before
fire.
you go there, I want to come back to
Go
there,
ahead.
but you
Yes.
mentioned just in passing something that must have happened when you were about 10 years old.
Yeah.
You said that you insisted on talking in class about Emmett Till
Yes.
and what was that situation? Do
Well,
you remember?
because although we didn't do it on a regular basis, but I would go south periodically during the summer. So when the Emmett Till experience happened, I was 10 years old. Um, that I identified with it.
Yes.
It was probably the first instance of Southern racial violence, racism that hit me personally.
Yes.
That there wasn't some far off story
Right.
that people were telling me about, and and so I was just so horrified by the experience. And back in those days, that the literature in my house, at least two things that was always in my house, was Ebony magazine and Jet, and I would read Jet religiously. I mean, that was just my thing, and so I saw this grave, this person, this young man, and and I just couldn't fathom
Yes.
how this could happen. I
Yes.
mean, I just, there was nothing in my experience that would even allow for this, even because my parents didn't talk about the South in an intense way of how dangerous it was. I mean, that even going down south when we had to not be able to go into the restaurants and what, that it wasn't talked about. It was just a problem.
Yes.
But it wasn't a big deal, if you
Yes.
will. I mean, it didn't shape our view of what we were doing. I mean, it didn't take any away our dignity. I didn't feel put down by that experience. So, but this Emmett Till situation was a whole nother thing for me. And I'm saying, well, how could this happen? And I wanted to talk about it in class, and teachers just and that the most of my educational experience was with white teachers, and they just didn't want to talk about it at all. And I can recall pushing it at one time, and they sent a note home to my mother about Michael's, but they characterized it as me being
Disrespectful.
disruptive.
Yeah,
I mean, it wasn't
oh.
the topic itself.
Yes.
And my mother, she said, look, I mean, I will tell, that he has a right to want to talk about this is what education is about. And if you don't want to talk about, I can't make you. But my son is doing nothing wrong. And she went to the principal, and she was really stood tall for that.
Yes.
I mean, she didn't tell me, Michael, stop doing this.
Right.
She,
Right.
I mean, she told me, look, under these circumstances, this is not the way it's going to be talked about. But it wasn't a put down of my energy to do that.
Right. Then by the time you get into high school, all kinds of things are going on in the world around you.
Yes.
And you are conscious of this.
Very conscious. I mean, that I should add that my brother, one of my brothers, well, in fact, two of my brothers, but one in particular, had joined the Nation of Islam in the '50s, so that I heard these things, these issues being discussed at some level in the house, Christianity, Islam, diet, and things. So that although at the time it didn't really resonate in my youth, but as I got to be about 15 in high school, my freshman, my 10th year in high school was 1960.
Right.
And by then I was becoming well aware of the civil rights movement. Clearly, Montgomery was lingering. The Albany movement occurred during the time when I was in high school. And even though it was hard to get information on it, at least Jet kept you informed, and the Afro-American Pittsburgh Courier, those newspapers, so that I became aware of issues. And by then I was really challenging authority. I mean, that I was fascinated by the whole prayer discussion in school. I decided that I was not going to say the Lord's Prayer anymore, which was a big deal back in 1962, which was a high school. I decided I was not going to pledge allegiance to the flag anymore. And my mother really supported it. I mean, she didn't, but by supporting it, she didn't necessarily agree with it, but she
Right,
supported my
right.
right
You're right to
to
do
take that
that.
stand. I
Yes.
would leave the room, and that I was challenging things, and that in the high school I went to, it was viewed as probably the worst high school in the city, or at least among the worst, the top three of the bottom.
This was Edison.
Yes, Thomas Edison was all boys. It had formerly been called a Northeast, and when the neighborhood changed where Edison was, the people of the old school had a new school built, and they took all the trophies and the traditions, so that what was left was basically African American, poor white working class, and Puerto Ricanos, and that we had a strong bond. There was no racial problem in the school. I mean, it was a really
That's fascinating.
intense bond. I mean, we felt. I mean, if anything, it was us against the world, if you will. That and we were committed to projecting a positive image of the school, but but the school, so that those of us who were academic students, they tended not to create problems for school administrators. The people who they saw as problem youth were shop students or commercial students. And so there was a group, a little circle that I was in, that was just a rebellious kind of group that just would challenge almost anything. I mean, but the problem that they were not used to academic students challenging authority. They were used to academic students being almost like an extension of authority.
That's like the academic students were the folks who were college bound.
Exactly, and we were. And so that I joined, so that, no, that I didn't join, we started a fraternity, and interracial fraternity, which was back then a big deal, because the neighborhood that the white students came from was a very racist neighborhood called Kensington. And I mean, that black people didn't even go to Kensington at night. So we started an integrated fraternity. The school was all boys, by the way.
Yes.
Too. And we started this integrated fraternity and then in terms of our fraternity, by my senior year, that like I was president of the senior class. Another member of the fraternity was president of the school. Another member of the fraternity was the secretary. So that we basically had this stature in the school. And there was a conflict that came up because we were in the school theater. And there was a conflict that came up that I frankly can't even remember what the conflict was. But there was a particular teacher who just did not like us. He just thought we were just arrogant and had to be put in our place. So that there was a circumstance where they accused us, believe it or not, of trying to take over the school.
Yes.
And so they had this special assembly, I mean, where they called it all the students, and they just denounced us. I mean, from the stage, the principal. And so at the end of that assembly, this particular teacher, he kind of led me into this little hole. He came up to me and he said, "Well, Simmons, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, Dr. Clark was the principal." I said, "Well, that was really foolish." So he said, "Are you calling Dr. Clark a fool?" So I said, "Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he acted like a fool." So he went to the principal. What they decided to do was, they didn't suspend us, but what they did was to tell me and two other of my cohorts that we would come to school, but we couldn't attend any classes. They refused to suspend us, so that for about a week, we came to school and sat in these separate rooms. We were not, teachers weren't allowed to talk to us. We were not allowed to talk to students. And they would have us straddle these lunch periods. And so, and that, like, I didn't tell my mother what was going on, I mean, initially. And so there was some people outside of school. There's this person named Dr. Eugene Wayman Jones, who was a very special person, whose brother used to be head of theology of Howard University. And he was a mentor of mine. And I talked to Dr. Jones. Because I was prepared to sue the school. I mean, and I was prepared to, because this was my senior year, and so that it looked like we weren't going to graduate, and the school could not believe that we weren't intimidated and wouldn't back up, particularly college-bound students. And
Was the group, the small group that was getting into the most trouble,
right.
was that all black?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That was all black, and they finally had to suspend us because this thing had gone on for over a week. And they called my mother up. And this one time, my mother really came to me and she was, I mean, the thought of me not graduating.
Yes, yes.
At that point, I had some scholarships that I wound up losing because of that, by the way. And she started crying, and I just apologized to the principal because I had no intention of apologizing. I was prepared to drop out of high school, and that was a big deal for me because it was never any question in my mind that I was going to college. And even though I never thought about the economics of it, my mother, we never discussed how I was going.
Right.
It was just that you were going to school.
Right.
And so I wound up, so that's one time when I backed up.
Yes.
And because my mother came to me and said, please, let this go. And I want you to graduate. And at the time, I had some scholarships to Lincoln University that I lost because of that, which is why I wound up going to Temple University. But she stood tall for it. She just said, look, this is just a no-win. And, you know, you don't want to not graduate. And so.
Did you have any teachers who were supportive?
Yeah, I did. One teacher, although yes. In fact, there was this one teacher, Gloria Daniels, Miss Daniels, who really, because at the high school there was that a lot of teachers did not care about teaching.
Yes.
I mean, some did. Now, we had some really good teachers, but some did not care. And then this notion of these arrogant black kids just, I mean, at the time I didn't even realize the profoundness of our behavior to some of these people. But the fact that, you know, we were just uppity as far as they were concerned. But this one teacher, Miss Daniels, really, I mean, the thing about Miss Daniels is that I'll never forget is that she turned me on to Richard Wright. I mean, I read A Native Son, which just exploded my brain. I thought my brain was going to burst when I read Native Son, but also read Brave New World. I read Animal Farm. Just started reading these ideas. And then I had, on my own, been fascinated by biographies. So I'd read like Clarence Darrow, which took me into the whole socialist tradition in the U.S., the Follett and the West Midwest. Because of Jackie Robinson, I was always reading things about racism. I would read Sinclair Lewis. I would read just all sorts of literature about social tension in society. And but Miss Daniels was the one who really put these political books on us, as well as taught us haiku poetry.
Yes.
But she just treated us with the utmost respect of our budding intellect, whereas some teachers taught down.
Yes.
But she taught up.
Yes.
And she graduated, I might add, from Talladega College, which I think is significant, frankly.
Well, you had a fascinating kind of preparation for the rest of your life there with taking on the powers that be in high school.
Yeah.
Now, at the same moment, you have been introduced through your family to another world, the world of the Nation of Islam.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that coming into your life and what that meant.
Well, the Islamic aspect of it meant very little at that point. I mean, it was Malcolm X and the critique of racism in society. I mean, I just worshipped him. I mean, at that point in my life.
Now, actually, Malcolm himself came into your life.
Right. I mean, he had always been around my life, but I began to recognize who he was. Although by then he was living in New York, and so I didn't see him at that kind of regularity. I saw him in my youth, but I would, you know, I mean, I would read everything I could about the civil rights movement, Nation of Islam. They had the killing of the Muslims in Los Angeles, 1962, and you know, then it was very hard to get information about black people. So that, you know, I mean, I just became a newspaper junkie. I mean, I started reading the New York Times, which was just unheard of in my environment. I mean, I mean, I would read 3, 4 papers a day. I mean, and then I worked in a drugstore, so I always had access to magazines and things. I mean, because I was employed. I mean, I haven't been unemployed since I was 12 years old. I mean, we always had some kind of job. And but in terms of high school, being in the drugstore, I had access to a lot of reading materials. I was Time, Newsweek. I mean, I just was constantly, but it was just the awareness of racism, the awareness of Africa, which I didn't know because I, like most, I mean, that there was no African consciousness in my house. I mean, that people didn't talk bad about it, but also wasn't a sense of pride. And so I grew up rooting for Tarzan like everybody else. And so just the awakening of something like that. I remember picking up Herbert Aptheker's book about the Black Slave Rebellions and the documenting history of Negro people, Volume 1.
How did you happen to pick up those books?
Because I was a reader, and on Sunday afternoon, the way that my high school sweetheart and I would spend our time was I would go around to bookstores, and I found there was an old communist named Bill Crawford who had a bookstore that in West Philadelphia, and I just bumped into it one day, and he saw this fertile mind, and he started giving me all kinds of books. So that's when I first read Harry Haywood on the National Question. I started reading Lenin. Then I met this person by the name of Max Stanford, who was head of this little group called RAM, Revolutionary African Movement, and which tied into the Robert Williams and the whole Monroe, North Carolina situation. So I was reading Robert Williams' newsletter, The Crusader. Then there was a magazine back then called Liberation, came out of New York, a guy named Dan Watts. So I was between the kind of communist literature, the black nationalist literature, Malcolm speaking. I mean, I was just on fire. Then I probably a freshman year in college, it was probably during my high school freshman year summer. I went to New York, and people told me about Oscar Michaud's bookstore, Richard B. Moore, and J.A. Rogers. I mean, just all these things just started exploding on me, and it was almost like, I mean, I was so angry that I felt that I'd been deceived, my education, and I was really on fire. I mean, I really was. The first demonstration I ever participated in was my senior. The only time I ever played hooky in my life was to go to a demonstration about that Cecil B. Moore of the NAACP had protesting construction jobs at
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, yes. In fact, it was only about 3 blocks from my house, and but so all this was exploding in '63. I mean, I just was on fire. I mean, had I been in the South during that time, I don't think I'd have gone to college. I know how to join SNCC.
Yes.
I mean, that like I didn't have any organized way to express all these things. I didn't know. My own experience was very limited. I mean, I hadn't traveled anywhere except maybe to New York to see family, but that's the only place I think. In fact, I particularly by myself, I traveled with my family. But the notion of just like going hadn't hit me then. So, but all these things was just coming in, and I just didn't know what to do with it.
You graduated from high school when?
June '63.
Okay, we're going to pick up from there. They're going to change cartridges now.
Okay.
And I'm going to